Our final lesson this week is about how economists think of things, especially wireless spectrum, in terms of property rights. Property designates those things commonly recognized as entities in respects of which a person or a group has exclusive rights. If you have property rights to something that you own, then you're considered to be able to use it in any way you like. Take, for instance, a house. Do you own the actual structure that's called the house? Do you own the land on which the house sits? If you own both, you're normally said to have property rights to the home. If you have property rights to the home, you can exclude other people from inhabiting the home. It has the characteristic of excludability. And if you are living in the house, it's not available for others to live in. Hence, the house also has rivalry. So it has both characteristics of a private good. But what about the term externalities we used in the last lesson? Externalities occur when you use something to which you have a property right, but it harms somebody else who isn't really involved with the ownership of this particular asset. Let's say we have a factory making paint. But in making the paint, the factory emits a lot of smoke, and the smoke harms people who live near the factory. That's an externality. We probably should take it into account. But how do we handle the problem of externalities? Externalities are caused by the problem that there are no property rights in certain areas. Who owns the air near the factory? This is a little bit like wireless spectrum. Who owns the spectrum? The air goes wherever it wants to go with its attached pollution. And wireless electromagnetic waves do the same in spectrum. They more or less go wherever they want to go. Externalities cause market inefficiencies. An externality arises when a person engages in an activity that influences the well-being of a bystander. But how do externalities impact wireless signals? As we've discussed before, wireless signals may interfere with each other. So if everybody tries to use the same frequency space at the same time, nobody's going to benefit from the use of the spectrum. The important question is, who owns the spectrum and thus controls it? In order to arrange ownership, we've used both government and private solutions. Government action is not always needed to solve the problem of externalities, although it probably is the most frequently suggested solution. I think the reason people so frequently turn to government regulation as the answer for spectrum problems is because it's the easiest solution for people to come up with. But in reality, the government may not be able to solve this problem. In fact, we had the government try to solve the spectrum problem for a very long period of time, starting back to when interference first became a difficulty in wireless transmissions in the early 20th century. That was the origin of the Federal Communications Commission. They were the government solution. But there is another private way to handle difficulties. Without government intervention, perhaps we could have contracting between parties who might potentially interfere with each other. In other words, we're left with a choice. We can have voluntary agreement, or we can have government sanctions. This is where a very important economist comes into play. Ronald Coase was an economist at the University of Chicago, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1991 for actually coming up with a concept called the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem is something that today we apply to wireless spectrum. Coase said, if you have two parties engaged in using something like radio spectrum that has some public goods characteristics, it's the case that if you allow one of the parties to actually own the spectrum, it's in that party's best interest to contract with other parties who want to use the spectrum. The resulting voluntary arrangements will be near optimal. Both the owner and the non-owners of the spectrum have a strong incentive to contract privately to gain the best use of the spectrum and reduce or eliminate the externality. When there's an externality, Coase said bargaining will lead to an efficient outcome regardless of the initial allocation of the property rights. In other words, would it be the case that we would get an optimal solution if we just let one firm or another own the spectrum space and contract with other initial non-owners who are potential users of the spectrum? Well, is that fair? Coase suggested the government could give the property rights away, or the government could sell the property rights. The beauty of the Coase theorem is it doesn't make any difference whether you sell the spectrum rights or whether you give them away, and it doesn't make any difference whether you sell them to Station A or give them to Station A, or whether you sell them to Station B or give them to Station B. It is the contracting that takes part after the property rights are set up that leads to optimality. This discussion of interference and property rights arrangements is an important one. It's at the very heart of our efforts to use wireless spectrum in the best possible manner. If there were no property rights for the spectrum, I could go about transmitting a signal that interferes with you. You can do the same thing to me, and what happens is we both wind up like colliding trains. Neither of us would benefit. On the other hand, if one of us has rights to the spectrum, there's a vested interest in us using the spectrum as efficiently and economically as possible. So I'm going to contract with you now if it makes economic sense. The result is, by allowing ownership of the wireless spectrum, regardless of who turns out to be the original owner, we would get a better use of spectrum than if we just simply allow people to use it willy-nilly. Remember the Coase theorem? It forms the rationale for the wireless spectrums that you see now taking place worldwide. Next week, in our economics lessons, we will examine wireless standards.